Hi, my name is Paul Braun. I'm presenting this work today as part of my master's thesis at Georgia Southern University, and today I'm going to be talking to you about hydrologic diversity and ecoregional variation in flow responses to landscape conditions. So I want to begin just talking about why flow is important. Well, one, water is habitat for aquatic species, and stream flow is this master variable. Human manipulation of river systems has been an issue, continues to be an issue, and it contributes to freshwater biodiversity loss. And really, just flow helps us understand the habitat requirements of native species. So what you see before you is a cartoon hydrograph. It's for a not so real stream, and it really I have this here to help understand some of these terms. You'll see magnitude, frequency, duration, timing, and rate of change. These things are from Richter et al. 1996. They're called dimensions of the flow regime, and basically they're just good ways to describe and measure flow. So magnitude, which is over on the right, measures the amount or availability of water at a specific location. Frequency in the top is how often drought or flood events occur. Duration, which is in the bottom left, is the amount of time over which specific conditions exist. So we get to see the duration of that low flow event down there. We've got timing, which is on the x-axis, and that's just really when certain water conditions occur, and that's generally associated with a date and is often used to describe, when we see minimums or maximums. And then we've got rate of change in the middle, which is flashiness or a measure of abruptness. And it really just is, how often we see the hydrograph change direction. So, we're going to be looking at stream discharge over time throughout this study, and these 5 dimensions of flow are going to be critical for the rest of this presentation. So we had 2 objectives. One, we wanted to rank the importance of, land cover, climate, physiography, and impoundments in predicting flow regimes. But we also wanted to assess, how ecoregions are mediating these relationships. So we used 375 USGS daily stream flow gauges. These things are all over the place. We used Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, and we narrowed thousands and thousands of flow gauges down to 375 gauges that all had 30 plus years of data. And that's extremely important that you have a kind of a historically deep data set when working with flow data. We also combined a bunch of level 3 ecoregions into 3 homogeneous groups. So for example, in the coastal plain, we combined the southern coastal plain, the southeastern plains, and the middle Atlantic coastal plain. And the idea was that these things weren't functioning differently from one another, so we combined them for the sake of having a more robust data set. And we did the same in the mountains and the Piedmont. So here's the study area. We had 91 gauges in the coastal plain, 112 in the mountains, and 172 in the Piedmont. So we used a package called eFlowStats in R to calculate these hydrologic indices. And these indices that you're seeing are used across all kinds of hydrological works. They're super cool because it allows us to kind of compare results from one paper to another. So these are kind of like standardized indices. They came out of the Hendrickson et al. 2006 work through USGS. And we've got 2 indices per dimension of the flow regime. So we also have 16 predictor environmental variables. And, the idea is these are all the things that can impact flow, or all the environmental variables that impact the flow regime. We also used 2 complementary modeling approaches throughout this research. So first we use redundancy analyses, which are a multivariate multiple regression model. And we also use random forest, which is a tree-based nonlinear regression model. So what you're seeing before you is a graph of a redundancy analysis. This has got all the ecoregions thrown in there. And based on this RDA, off the bat, you see that the first 2 axes capture about 47% of the variation in hydrology among sites, with each, represented by a circle. Each circle is gray is the Piedmont, black is the mountains, white is the coastal plain. Axis number one is really just a stream size axis. Sites to the right of the plot have larger drainage areas, and sites to the left have smaller drainage areas. Bigger streams have a greater average magnitude, which isn't surprising, and then smaller streams to the left had steeper hydrographs and more frequent high flow events relative to the size of the stream. The second axis, that's the Y, is definitely more interesting in my opinion. It really separates these three ecoregions from one another. Sites toward the top of the plot were from the coastal plain, and they also exhibited greater amounts of wetland land cover, longer lasting high flows, and longer lasting low flows. On the other hand, sites toward the bottom of the plot represented the Piedmont, and which were also associated with flashier hydrographs, meaning the hydrograph changed directions more times. And we were really surprised to see that Piedmont sites were not hydrologically intermediate to coastal plain and mountain sites. Rather, the mountain sites were more of the intermediate. And in your head, you would kind of surmise that the Piedmont would really be transitional, which is not what we found. This is interesting because it shows us how flow and environmental conditions vary between ecoregions. But what we're also interested in is how flow response varies between ecoregions. And this is where random forest really helps us out. And what we found was that both the RDA and the random forest indicated that environmental flow responses tended to be more ecoregion specific. So now let's synthesize this information across all 10 response variables, all 16 predictor variables, and all 3 ecoregions, and see what generalities we can make. I'm going to show you 2 charts back to back here. For these random forest results, hotter colors indicate a variable that is more important. Cooler colors indicate variables that are less important, with white or blanks being the coolest. So some takeaways from this table off the bat is, one, that stream size, watershed area is extremely important across all 3 ecoregions, whereas other predictors tended to be more ecoregion specific, like I was saying back at the RDAs. And you can see that, for one, in the mountains, limestone geology is extremely important. In the coastal plain, wetlands was very important. And in the Piedmont, development was very important. So when we look at these environmental variables by flow dimension, it's interesting that anthropogenic influences like dam construction, for example, and land cover change tend to influence flow metrics of duration, timing, and rate of change more than magnitude. Temperature was also, important across all of these flow dimensions, especially in regard to flow timing. And this is worth noting, as we consider the effects of climate in the future on our aquatic ecosystems. So when we think about implications of this work, first of all, models might not transfer well across ecoregions, and this is definitely something to consider. The scope of this project, we're in the Southeast, we've got Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. These models might not transfer well in terms of other places. It's also interesting to consider that anthropogenic stressors like land cover change, for example, and flow regulation, these things had a strong influence on duration, predictability, and rate of change rather than on magnitude. And when you think about flow regulation and imperiled species, oftentimes what we focus on is magnitude. So the ecology and evolution of fishes is probably strongly tuned to flow timing, duration, and rate of change. And these things aren't generally what are being considered when we think about flow regulation. So I'd like to acknowledge the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. They've been amazing. I got to work with them doing some robust red horse stuff for my research assistantship. It was an incredible experience, and I'd like to thank them for funding my research. I'd also like to thank Garrett Strickland at Georgia Southern, as well as Dr. Checo at Georgia Southern as well. So at this time, I am available for questions. Thank you so much for listening to my talk.